I'd like to introduce Dione Hills, who's going to be talking about commissioning and management of complex evaluations. Dione is down on the programme as being from the Tavistock Institute, but she's very much part of the CECAN family. Welcome to Dione, and over to you. We'll have the opportunity to ask a few questions of her when she's finished talking.
Thanks, Nigel. Welcome back. Hope you enjoyed the cakes. I did. Some of the questions before prefigured this section, so let me just talk a little bit about, well, how do we know if our system is complex? Many of the features we talked about before were there, but this, what's called the Stasi Matrix, Ralph Stasi developed this some time ago when he was applying complexity to organization and leadership and management. And he identified two particular dimensions that are really crucial. One is the extent to which whatever it is that you're looking at, you're fairly certain about, or whether there's a great deal of uncertainty there, as there is in any innovative or experimental or exploratory program or policy. And the other is the extent to which there's agreement or lack of agreement between the different parties involved. And I think someone already raised this question, that in complex programs you have many different organizations, different departments, perhaps different individuals involved who might have very different perspectives on what's required. So all of these two different dimensions are very important, both in terms of choosing what kind of methodology or evaluation approach you take, but also crucially in terms of its the management and the commissioning of the evaluation. So Helen's going to talk about the choice of methods, and I'm going to be talking about management and commissioning. So complexity in a policy or a program or a project increases when they're highly innovative. They're in an area that we're still exploring, going ahead. We don't know quite what's going to happen, and that increases the uncertainty. When the environment is rapidly changing, as we all know it currently is, and that adds even more uncertainty because there's so many different moving parts moving simultaneously. When there are many layers and many organizations involved in a program or policy, then you've got many more individuals and pointers in the complex map involved there. And usually there's no one body, one organization, one department who's got control over all those parts. In a complex policy or program, there are often many different actions being introduced simultaneously. And they might be at different levels. There might be some national initiative going on within a policy or program, and there might be local initiatives going on simultaneously, and other things going on a regional level. And the more actions, the more levels, the more potential there is for more individuals, organizations, agencies involved, which bring a diversity of views and opinions to the situation. And that's where you get diversity of views and often lack of agreement between the different parties involved. It's a little cartoon I found. Quinn Patton published this lovely book called Developmental Evaluation, which is absolutely superb account of applying complexity thinking to evaluation. I don't know if you can read it, but I'm neither a good cop nor a bad cop, Jerome. Like yourself, I'm a complex amalgam of positive and negative personality traits that emerge or not, depending on the circumstances. And I'm afraid I've sometimes, as a long-term evaluator, had to tell the commissioner of a program of this program sometimes works and sometimes doesn't work, depending on the circumstances. It's not a popular message. So evaluations fail in complex settings, and I think Martha mentioned that it's very useful to have examples of evaluations that have failed because they've chosen the wrong method or gone about it the wrong way. Fortunately, last year, this wonderful book, which I absolutely recommend to anyone who's doing evaluation, came out from, and it's 22 examples of evaluations that went very badly wrong, and they're all from experienced evaluators, and they explain what the program was, what went wrong, and what they learned, and what they do differently next time. thoroughly recommend it. And I did a bit of an analysis, really, on comparing what went wrong in these evaluations to our understanding of complex systems. So the first thing is that very often they were taking place in a system that the people commissioning both the intervention or the evaluation didn't fully understand. And very often in the early stages there were all sorts of red flags going on, and these were ignored, partly because people were taking a very linear approach to understanding it, and just sort of, well, you know, it's a bit of a mess here, but we'll plug through and get through it. The next issue was that key stakeholders hadn't been properly engaged or consulted in the process, either of drawing up the programme or particularly the evaluation. Sometimes the wrong evaluation approach and methods was used, but actually there's only one striking example in the whole book, which was the real reason for the breakdown of the evaluation, and that was the application of an experimental method in a system that just fought back, basically. People game played, and so you just didn't get a control group and an intervention group. Disagreement between stakeholders about appropriate methods and findings came up quite a lot. Major turnover in commissioners and other stakeholders. Does this sound familiar to anyone? Yes. Individuals and groups of stakeholders block access to information and data. This was surprisingly common. And that's particularly if they haven't been properly consulted and involved in decisions about the evaluation. The evaluation designs weren't or couldn't be adapted to meet changing circumstances. And this is a blog I wrote, which is on the CECAN website, in which I've got lots of examples of all those. I just want to talk about a couple briefly. In one of these, it was not involving the key stakeholders. Basically, this was a communication plan was developed to increase understanding and take-up of services in the government department. This might be a bit familiar to some of you. The theory of change map was drawn up with people, a group of people, stakeholders, which identified that the main problem was not lack of communication, but lack of trust between the public and the public servants. And so they designed the evaluation approach around this understanding. Unfortunately, the staff delivering the program weren't informed of this, and they got very upset. And they just didn't like the methodology, they didn't like messages coming out. There was more and more sort of scrutiny and complaints, and eventually the evaluation was ditched. Unable to agree, and it's interesting, you see, so that was actually a method, it was a theory of change method, which is specifically for complex intervention, so it wasn't the methodology that was wrong. And in this one, there was one partner in a partnership who had developed a training program, and basically they wanted to introduce a developmental evaluation as it was being rolled out to other partners, because they realized that as the intervention, although it had been evaluated, was rolled out to new situations, it would change, it would adapt to meet its new circumstances. Developmental evaluation, which Helen will say a little bit more about, is one in which you're doing repeated cycles of test and evaluate, learn, adapt. Basically, however, the other partners simply wanted a much more standard process and impact evaluation. Basically, you develop it, you assume it's sort of static, and then you test the impact. And basically, that's the approach they went for. But at the end of the day, the evaluation was neither satisfying to the partner who wanted developmental evaluation, nor for the other partners, because the intervention did continue to evolve and develop. So that's the problem where you didn't really get the stakeholders on the same page, understanding the nature of a complex system and responding to that with the evaluation design. So in terms of the kind of issues you've got, these are some of the characteristics which I think Alex put up before. Multiple interactions and influences. Well, obviously you need to ensure that the right evaluation approaches are used for a complex system. Helen will be talking about. The systems are in continual change or may resist change. So you might need to change the evaluation approach as time goes by and use agile management techniques. And also, when you report on the findings, you have to have caveats around that this is still changing. You know, we don't have the final answer there. In an open system where the context and the history matters, you often have to cut across different departmental boundaries involving multiple stakeholders. And you do need additional resources to get data about the context and history. Very often evaluations focus so much on the intervention itself and the outcomes that they just can't take that broader view, and it does take resources to get the broader view. If you've got multiple perspectives in play, then you do need to put in time and effort, actually. It does take time to bring stakeholders together to get some alignment of understanding. The nature of change is unpredictable when you need expertise there who have knowledge of a wide range of evaluation approaches. I do a lot of training across different government departments, and each government department has its favourite sort of types of evaluation that they like, and sometimes the people there haven't actually seen the whole spectrum. They've learned about the ones that their departments do, which might or might not be suitable for complex interventions. So getting that broader view, you might have to look beyond your normal suppliers. If you've got multiple causality, then you do need a wider range of data sources there. So again, that has implications for resourcing. And this thing about complexity is difficult to communicate. It does need additional time to explain and ensure alignment between views. One of the things I've noticed quite a lot, because I've been thinking about complexity for a number of years before I got involved with CECAN, but I sometimes find, and everyone here might find this, one bit of my brain understands it, and the other bit is sort of going along its normal pattern of linear assumptions. And you have to kind of keep, oh, right, okay, I assumed that was linear. All right, is there a feedback loop there? So it is a continual process of growth and learning. It's not a one-off, I got complexity, whoa, So, am I pointing to the wrong place? Okay. So, we heard earlier from Stephen that the Magenta Book identifies a number of key elements to evaluation in planning and management, and on the whole this is a fairly linear process, and we understand that: scoping, leading and managing, choosing methods, conducting the evaluation, and using and disseminating the findings. In a complex system, where should I be pointing this so it works? To the screen? To this? Oh, good, okay. The stages might be much less clear-cut, and I really like the question that someone asked about going back into the policy system, because very often you have to start thinking complexity much earlier on so that you can begin to build the complex evaluation approach into the thinking about the intervention much earlier. Because what a complexity perspective helps with, and the evaluation will hopefully also help, is really getting insight and understanding about the system, and also enable you to respond to new learning as you learn more about the system and the complex features in the system as they emerge. And Martha mentioned the DEFRA work we did, which had a much more embedded approach to evaluation and policy making, and I'll refer you to the flyer that Martha showed, which is in your folder, which explains this particular one. I love it, yin-yang sign in the middle. It seems very appropriate somehow. So coming back to the dimensions of complexity that we mentioned earlier, in terms of management and commissioning, you do need much more of a collaborative design and in a very early stage, and sometimes getting evaluators on board very early on, or someone with an understanding of complex adaptive systems in the very early stages before you've even commissioned the evaluation to help scope it, can be very useful. The importance of engaging widely, as I mentioned, it was people on the ground actually who ultimately had to provide the data for the evaluation, but they hadn't actually been involved in the planning process, and so they hadn't got their head around the understanding of complexity and why a particular evaluation design was chosen. I think Helen will be talking more about this, really important as the Magenta Book. And just to make this general point is all the points in our guide are actually about good evaluation. And they're all actually in the main Magenta book. It's just that when you're dealing with a complex system, it's more so. Yeah? So it's like we shouldn't be telling people something new here. It's just that you've got to pay particular attention to these features when you're dealing with a complex system. So developing systems or logic maps early on, but understanding that this is not a one-off activity at the beginning. You have to keep revising it as new understanding comes in. And that's why you have to adopt an agile, adaptive management system where you're regularly reviewing and updating your plans. And think systems and seek data about the system as well as the intervention and the outcomes. So as Martha mentioned, we came up with a list of questions for commissioners and managers of evaluation. Does the system or policy or program give evidence of complexity? Are there variations? If you're delivering the intervention across multiple sites, is it likely to look different in different settings? Are there additional expertise or stakeholders you might want to involve? Do you have some system modeling tools that would be useful to drawing up an initial map, not just of the intervention, but of the policy setting? And as we heard, we've been doing participative systems mapping with some government departments, mapping a policy context, and then you can look at the individual intervention within that context. Management, is there regular discussion with stakeholders and enough time bringing them together? Has flexibility been built in to allow for change? Has an adaptive management or agile process been considered? And have differences of view between different members of the advisory steering group been brought to the surface and discussed? In terms of use and dissemination, has there been an opportunity for those involved in the evaluation design to be also involved in dissemination? They might have a more in-depth understanding of the complexity. Have they been kept informed about changes in the programme and its evaluation? The programme might look very different at the end of the evaluation to the beginning. Have they been given indication of the complexity and why the impacts or recommendations sort of reflect that complexity and are perhaps not as certain as they might be in another evaluation design? And also alerted to the fact that more change might continue to happen after the evaluation has come to an end. So just a few conclusions. I mean, basically evaluation can help policymakers deal with the complexity, and I think this is hopefully a feature that is throughout this our supplementary guide. You know, how can evaluation help your policymakers to make sense of the complexity? But that will only happen if the evaluation activities are well integrated into the policy and as early as possible in the early stages of modelling analysis. So the line between appraisal and evaluation might be less clear-cut. Including stakeholders in planning and mapping an intervention can really help understand the complexity. People on the ground understand complexity, even if they don't call it complexity. They know where the kickbacks are going to be, where the obstacles, who are the key people you have to get involved, which we might call nodes, in the complex system. And if you haven't got them on board, there'll be an obstacle. If you have got them on board, there'll be an ally. It's all common sense in a way. All we're doing is presenting a different language to describe these common sense features. Ensure expectations and assumptions are carefully managed. People want to know what works. Of course, as evaluators, we always ask what works. That's the question, which is a great question. You know, it's just difficult to answer in complex settings. And the governance and management needs to be flexible to respond to emergent changes. And just to say that we did some very useful work. One of the fellow people who had a fellowship with CECAN on commissioning and the obstacles to of complexity in the commissioning system. I think, is there an EPPN or is it just a presentation on the website? I can't remember. Where you had the workshop, didn't you? Yeah. So, above all, This may sound jokey or silly, but the fact is complexity kind of throws a lot of our assumptions that are built into the policy-making system into confusion. Because we're used to thinking linear, not complex. So when we're faced with complexity, we might think we're doing something wrong or someone's doing something wrong. Very often people think the evaluator's doing something wrong. It might not be that you're doing something wrong, it's just you're dealing with a complex system, and hopefully we're giving some tools that can give you a handle or an insight or begin to unpick what's going wrong and saying, it's not just a mess, it's not just someone's doing something silly or incompetent or unprofessional. There's complexity there, and we have to understand it. So, got about
Thank you very much.
a few minutes.
Thank you. I'm Rebecca Godar. I work doing evaluation with local government. And I'm really interested in what you're talking about the kind of iterative approach to evaluations. And I'm wondering about the kind of the pacing of that, like the duration of different stages. You talk about agile management methods, which often talks about kind of 2-week sprints. That feels a bit daunting. And I'm just wondering about that kind of duration for those loops as you think about going back and iterating and your experience of that.
I don't know enough about agile management. Does it assume it's always a two-week sprint? I mean, in developmental evaluation, I would say that the cycles were much closer to 3 months. But it depends a lot on the program or the policy that you're looking at and the likely pace of delivery and intervention. But I think also sometimes it can be aligned with what decisions have to be made. So, and that's where developmental evaluation evolved from Quinn Patton's earlier work on utilization-focused evaluation. You know, if you're focusing the evaluation on what decisions actually have to be made, when and by whom, and actually bringing that quite a low into the policy-making system itself. You know, what decisions have to be made on the ground, and then you can tailor the evaluation and the questions and the data to give them the right information that they need to make the next decision. Does that answer it?
My comment would be about the don't panic, really. I think, as a comment, I think a challenge in this area is presenting this information in a way that enables decision makers to build on it. I remember Margaret Thatcher famously said about some minister, I can't remember who, everyone else brings me problems, he brings me solutions. But I think it's not about... So an analogous to that would be not just showing how this is really, really complex and confusing, but actually showing here is a way in to dealing with this complexity in taking the programme forward. And I just wondered if you had any reflections on that.
Yeah, that's very pertinent to some work that Ben and I are doing at the moment of looking at evaluation in the charitable sector. And we've actually been talking to a number of charities who are dealing with complex interventions and trying to deal with them in a systemic way. And they were saying very clearly, don't tell us about complexity. It just makes us feel overwhelmed and disempowered. We don't like complexity. So finding a way to introduce the notion of complexity in a way that isn't disempowering, isn't confusing, I think is a real challenge. I mean, I hope with the pictures that we produced is the first stage. You know, it's like, I think we're all at the stage, and one of the things I did with CECAN was to look particularly at complex evaluation capacity building. What does it take to enable people to embrace complexity in their thinking? And it's going to be a slow cultural shift, because there's a lot of assumptions in the system already that have to be rethought, and it's not going to happen overnight. But I think all of us are going to work together, hopefully, to understand how it can be made useful rather than disempowering. Ben, do you have any thoughts on that? Well, I think as you've got the microphone to hand.
Yeah, I'm Ben Shaw, I'm Deputy Director of CECAN. I think one of the big messages from CECAN is that complexity is present everywhere, and lots of people have implicit ways of dealing with it. So one of the things we're trying to do is make it explicit and say it is going to pose challenges the way you do policy, and you can't ignore it, because if you ignore it, you're likely to get bitten by it. So getting approaches which useful for people operating different levels. So you don't need to be, know everything about complexity and all the theory and everything to use it, but making it people aware of it conceptually when you're commissioning work, developing policy is important, and then equipping people with tools to manage it in a way that I think the other message we've had from CECAN is trying to get away from evaluation being ex post and saying actually getting up front in the policy design process and thinking about the system, as Dione said, is quite important. So I think that light bulb moment when you explain a complex system is quite a simple concept, which sounds paradoxical. But when you explain it to people, they go, oh, yeah, I've seen that in my work. And then they can get engaged. But if you just hit them over the head with it, it can be quite daunting. So we're working on that.
Yeah. A question came up the other day about when you're teaching people evaluation for the first time, do you talk about complexity early on? And in a sense, that's difficult. It's quite hard to get your head around evaluation. But on the other hand, you don't want to teach people evaluation skills that they then have to unlearn when they can face complexity. So it's a little bit chicken egg. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Jessica Roma, and I work for the Wellcome Trust. This is a question that I think builds on some of the points that you've been making recently about translating findings and helping particularly policymakers and the users and commissioners understand how they can engage with it. And from your presentation, you talked a lot about investing more time at the beginning, particularly in the selection of methodologies. But I wonder if you can talk about how complexity changes the way in which you do interpretation of findings as well, which I didn't hear a lot of. And so that's a question, does it change that? Precisely going with the idea that there are less precise responses to complex questions, and what it might mean in practice will probably vary and might need to be done in partnership.
Interesting, a very interesting question. I think once you've got a sort of complexity mindset somewhere in your head, you're automatically understanding the findings that come through from the evaluation within that mindset. So hopefully, as more people are thinking complexity, then yes, of course, it's almost like a frame through which that's interesting. There would seem to be a whole series of chain events here, or particularly the notion of actually my intervention was a contribution to change. It wasn't the one thing causing change, and standing back, using some of those notions to actually explain what was going on. But then you can just say it in very simple language, but you don't have to explain all the thinking that's going on in your head behind it. It's like, okay, this helped make sense of why this thing was different here and here. Something as simple as that. So yes, it would be used all the time in interpreting the findings, but I don't think we've necessarily nailed exactly how. Useful question though, thank you. Yeah.
I've got the microphone, so I'm using the microphone. I think there's a sort of spectrum I think we've seen from a traditional sort of focus on knowledge generation, definitive knowledge at one end, and this is a parody of it, but things where you definitely know and it's applicable everywhere, to the other end where you know nothing and have to prod something and see what happens and react immediately. And so we're, I think, exploring that spectrum of knowledge to process for understanding what's going on. And that's, I think, some people, making those sort of knowledge processes more explicit is quite an important aspect of this, which we haven't particularly unpicked yet, but I think we'd like to do more on.